Hi, I'm Will, and it's just me this time. There we go. We're gonna pick an input device here, probably keyboard, because I prefer keyboard for platformers. Okay. So, this is Jade Phoenix. As you can see, we can pick between two characters, Pat, Jade, and Wandy. They handle almost the same except for a few things that we're not going to see here, so I'm just going to pick Pat Jade and stick with her. So, like any ambitious early indie game, Jade Phoenix has some pretty major sources of inspiration. While some of the movement and enemy design feels like it came from Mega Man, the momentum and ability to bounce off enemies' heads comes fresh from Mario, the mix of vertical and horizontal level design captures a bit of Sonic's essence, and the music and some power-ups are reminiscent of a few specific Treasure games. As well as all that, you can see a bit of Strive's somewhat non-standard approach to platformer design that carried all the way over to Freedom Planet. Bottomless pits are extremely rare, and only appear in a handful of levels, and most enemies don't deal contact damage. When I say this game is ambitious, I really do mean it. Even this beta version of Jade Phoenix packs in a whopping 25 levels, excluding some boss stages. It's true that most of them are only about a minute or two long, like the few I'll be covering in this video, but some of the later levels last upwards of 10 minutes, and the game continuously introduces brand new enemies and mechanics up until the last couple stages. Add to all that the fact that most of this is done by Strife himself, the art and sound, and it becomes even more impressive considering just how many incidental animations and different sound effects there are. It's quite polished. So the variety and polish on display for Jade Phoenix are both impressive, but they're hampered by somewhat unwieldy controls, occasionally questionable level design, and perhaps most offensively the camera. So in 2D platformers we have two axes of movement of course, and I'll address the issues Jade Phoenix's camera has with them separately. When it comes to the horizontal axis, most platformers incorporate a sort of window in which the character can move back and forth without the camera following along. This means that more precise movement can be executed without the player having to deal with the camera wobbling all over the place. You can see this technique used even in fairly primitive forms for games like the original Super Mario Bros. And Metroid. If you make especially light movements, you can see that Jade Phoenix actually does have a very tiny window, but it's only somewhere between 4 and 8 pixels wide, so it doesn't do a whole lot of good. That said, the window definitely exists, so the question then becomes why isn't it bigger? And the answer to that would be because a bigger camera window would cause even bigger issues for this game. To return to the example of Metroid, talking about the original NES game, Samus is fairly small on screen, as are her enemies, and horizontal movement is fairly slow. The player character and obstacles are quite big in Jade Phoenix, and movement is fast. As a result, a simple, larger-sized camera window would end up giving the player less time to react to threats, because they'd always have less screen real estate in the direction they're moving. Plenty of platform games have already done well to approach this issue, such as Super Mario World, which will smoothly pull the camera ahead of Mario after he's begun moving in a given direction. That said, I would imagine that this sort of solution was difficult for Strife at the time, being that this would have been the first game he made in which such a technique would be necessary. And Multimedia Fusion 2 likely didn't help matters much. Anyway, there are also issues with the vertical axis of the camera. For example, it's a bit silly that Pat Jade is smack dab in the center of the screen, because this means that for the majority of the horizontally oriented levels, a bit less than half the screen has you staring at the ground unless you're at the bottom of the level. The more sinister problem, however, is fairly similar to the issue with the x-axis. The camera can't help but follow the player wherever they go, and levels with a lot of vertical movement can quickly become tiring as a result. Before I continue my tirade on the vertical axis, I'd like to point out that I shouldn't be falling off these ledges, and if you look carefully, it looks like I'm landing and then Pat Jade's feet are moving, and then I'm falling off them. So that's another issue I didn't quite notice until I started recording. Anyway, the issues with the vertical movement of the camera are especially noticeable in vertical levels like this one. Again, this issue can be solved at least somewhat by implementing a camera window, which worked pretty well for the original Metroid, but I'm not sure that the game has enough real estate in the vertical directions to properly accommodate that. There are more advanced solutions, of course, but I think really anything would have been better than this sort of simple, smoothed movement that the camera has going on. If you combine these camera issues with Jade Phoenix's fairly noisy visual aesthetic, it makes for a game that's pretty hard to play for long periods of time. Thankfully, the game does offer the option to double the size of the window, and that helps a little bit with the eye strain. Anyway, at the beginning of this video, you might recall me mentioning that, in spite of Jade Phoenix's impressive volume of content, the version you see here is still a beta. So then you might ask, what kind of things could we have expected to see in the finished release? Well, there were at least a few incomplete stages kicking around at the time Jade Phoenix was abandoned, with these levels also including their own unique enemies and visuals. Some of them even had unique power-ups, including one that seems an awful lot like the Tanuki suit from Super Mario Bros. 3. There was also an unfinished world map akin to what you might see in certain Super Mario games, and in this unfinished overworld was also a shop interface where one could spend those collectibles we've been gathering, seemingly in order to upgrade equipment. In addition to all that, the story likely would have seen a fair bit more fleshing out. In this current version of the game, dialogue occurs 2 or maybe 3 times, and the instances in which it occurs are pretty severely disjointed. In fact, we've got one of those instances coming up right now. Before we get there though, I'd like to praise the game one last time. I like the way that these clone characters we're seeing here interact with the environment. They can break windows in the background as they move around, and some NPCs will also interact with them in some ways. There are other fun details too, such as the fact that lanterns will break when they sustain damage, even from enemies. Both these things are good examples of Strife's impressive attention to detail, and they go some way to create an engaging world, but then we have things like this. Punchy and I spent a lot of time making fun of the story on writing in Freedom Planet, but I think it's important to remember that writing is a skill you have to practice, and Jade Phoenix is clear evidence that Strife has gotten better with time. Jade Phoenix's story is based on an old group of friends Strife used to hang out with, so the writing is reference heavy and borderline incomprehensible to anyone outside this group. Who's NSQ? How does Pat Jade know her? Heck, who are any of the characters we've been meeting up to this point? What is any of this? Why must this game remind me of the dark ages that were my middle school years with words like OMG, LOL, ZZ, Ruffle, Ruffle, Potato Salad? We'll never receive answers to these questions, not in the context of this game at least. So instead we'll fight a boss. And by fight a boss, I mean despawn the clones she's throwing at us by standing at the edge of the screen. In fact, I'm not even sure I would have needed to jump over those things. I'm pretty sure they would have just run off the edge and disappeared without that. Of course, Evil NSQ eventually gets tired of this, has a quick monologue in which she politely asks if she can kill us herself, and then jumps down and tries to pogo us with an umbrella. NSQ can't be hit during this phase of the fight. After a few bounces, she becomes vulnerable, at which point we can deal a heart of damage, and then she'll pogo again. After the second round of dodging and attacking though, she regenerates, and it turns out we have to break out this bird guy from his cage, so he can, quote, roast this imbecile. As silly and janky as this boss fight feels, I think that having the player attack a brand new target, particularly one that's in the air, is an interesting way to change up the dynamic of the fight. It's a shame we never see anything like this anywhere else in the game. The future boss fights are mostly pretty standard. So we break this bird guy out of the cage, and again he will, as I said, roast this imbecile, which drains her health completely. And NSQ looks like she's got bee stings on her face. And that's the fight. Pat Jade and the revived NSQ have a quick exchange, and the stage ends after that. With that, I'll be concluding this video on Jade Phoenix. While this certainly wasn't Strife's first game, I feel that it was the first game he worked on that truly reflects on him as a developer now, if only in a small handful of ways. Next up, we'll be covering Super XD Panic, hopefully without a several-week gap between videos. See you then.